There are reports that two types of bubonic plague have been found in northern China and southern China, and the local government has launched a level 4 emergency response to the situation. Also, it appears that the actor Jackie Chan will get to keep his $17.6 million mansion after the auction was suddenly withdrawn the day before its planned foreclosure. And the CCP is moving forward with its new campaign to take over private industry under the guise of a mixed ownership government program. I'll be going in-depth into this. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. Now, you may remember some of our earlier reporting on an outbreak of the bubonic plague in China. There are now reports that two types of the plague have been found in northern China and in southern China. Now, after the original reports of a case in Inner Mongolia, a new case was confirmed on the evening of September 27th in Yunnan. The local government launched a level 4 emergency response to prevent the spread of the plague soon after it was confirmed. It was allegedly found after authorities conducted screenings for the disease across the whole county, allegedly after 3 rats were found dead in a village. Now, in addition to this, there have been 6 confirmed cases and 3 deaths from the bubonic plague in Mongolia this year. Now, it's important to note, the Chinese Communist Party is not known for being honest with cases when it comes to viruses. The Chinese Communist Party is known to cover these things up. But we can say, if they held county-level tests, county-wide tests, and issued public reports on this, in other words, media are reporting on it, it may be more serious than they claim. And again, their claim also that some of them found 3 dead rats and reported this, and they launched investigations on the bubonic plague. Again, this is pretty suspicious in China, where finding a few dead rats is not that big of a deal typically. Why would the CCP again be holding county-wide tests? Why would it be issuing public reports? And why would it launch investigations like this, allegedly of someone finding 3 dead rats in a place so far removed from Inner Mongolia where the other outbreaks are taking place? Again, this does seem suspicious. We'll have to see what happens as this goes forward. And on a related note, with the CCP virus outbreaks in China, a mother of a girl who died from the virus in China filed a lawsuit on September 23rd against the governments of Wuhan City, the epicenter of the virus, and of Hubei province where Wuhan is located. She's looking for 2 million yuan in compensation. That's equal to over $292,000. Now, this marks the 5th lawsuit of its kind in China filed against CCP authorities for covering up the virus. And as China opens back up to international travel, it's expected its tourism to rebound ahead of the Mid-Autumn Festival, which falls on October 1st this year. Part of the reopenings of travel to China is through its reporting that the virus is largely under control. The CCP is claiming it has victory over the virus. But reports on this read contrary to what the CCP is saying. Many parts of China, such as Xinjiang, are still being placed on lockdown, again for virus outbreaks. And in different parts of China, they have lockdown measures being put in place even though they're not calling it official lockdowns. And so one of 2 things are happening here. Either the CCP is lying to its own people on why it's putting lockdowns in place, sometimes citywide lockdowns, or it's lying to the world about having defeated the virus. It's one of these 2. Now, yes, the regime says the number of cases are minimal, but the heavy measures it's put into place at a time when its economy is still struggling, and also its track record of being dishonest about the number of cases, suggests the risk is still high. Now, in other news, the Chinese Communist Party is going to increase its operations to target corrupt Chinese officials sending money overseas. The announcement was made on September 27th by the Commission for Discipline Inspection. It's according to South China Morning Post. It had a statement titled, quote, "Overseas is no haven for transferring assets." The statement was issued after Wan Ting-chu, a Canada-based singer, called for justice for her mother who has been detained by Chinese authorities for 6 years under accusations of bribery. Now, this follows another story from South China Morning Post on September 25th, which noted that cryptocurrencies are being used in China to send money abroad and for transfers that make it, quote, difficult to trace the source. Now, they say a couple different things. These articles suggest that the CCP will make a harsher crackdown on money flowing out of China. This could mean not only just Chinese Communist Party officials trying to get their money out of China, but also the normal track of Chinese getting their money out of China because they lack faith in the integrity of the Chinese currency. And this also says something even bigger on the motivations of the CCP when it comes to these transactions. Now, when they talk about money flowing out of China, again through gambling, through casinos and these things, they're saying they cannot trace the transactions. Part of this new digital currency the CCP is rolling out is the capability to trace every single transaction and to also control transactions, such as, for example, preventing money from flowing out of China. And this also tells us something else. One of the big hubs for gambling in China is Macau. The CCP has set up Macau as having the same kind of international trade agreements that Hong Kong used to have. And the CCP very likely, based on these reports, is going to make a larger crackdown on Macau and on the financial institutions there, again, when it comes to money flowing out of China. And now for the broader stories for today. Now, first off, the Chinese Communist Party is moving forward with this new campaign to take over private industry under the guise of a mixed ownership government program. Now, a recent development within the party suggests there's now a divide in leadership over this. Now, state media reported that on September 17th, the State Council announced that China is ready to give its, quote, continued unswerving support to reform and develop state-owned and private businesses. State media also said greater effort will be made in deepening mixed ownership reform, strengthening the modern corporate structure, and developing sound market-oriented operating mechanisms. Now, the State Council is technically the government of China. It's mainly in charge of the economy and it runs a lot of the state-run businesses. But it's still under the control of the Communist Party, meaning that Xi Jinping still has the ultimate authority over it. But the head of the State Council, Li Keqiang, has also been involved in a conflict with CCP leader Xi Jinping when it comes to the image of leadership within China. Now, the recent announcement appears to align with this conflict. The reports use language that CCP leaders typically avoid, but Li Keqiang states them directly. Now, this recent announcement appears to align with this conflict, and state media appear to have censored Li Keqiang's speech, which gives us some hints on what's happening behind the scenes in China's leadership, especially as it relates to what's in store for Chinese businesses. Now, in terms of censorship, state media avoided some of the more crucial details of Li Keqiang's remarks. Instead, they focused on more CCP-aligned statements, such as mixed ownership when it comes to business and government intervention, and on how private companies should follow the Chinese Communist Party. The full transcript of his speech, however, was later published by the State Council website. Again, he's in charge of the State Council, and it showed that he deviated from some of the official party lines on this. He talked, for example, about the need to stabilize the growth of private industry by, quote, all means possible, and also pointed out that the private sector in China constitutes over 90% of new jobs in the country. Now, Chinese state media published similar statistics back in 2018 when they wrote that the private sector in China brings about 60% of the country's GDP growth and over 90% of new jobs. The point is simple, though. The private sector is the main driver of China's economy, and the average Chinese citizen depends on the private sector for work. Now, in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party, though, state-owned business is the lifeline of the regime and its leaders, and taking over private industry through a mixed ownership narrative, a public and private model, is the party's new focus. Now, Li Keqiang's statements that state-owned enterprises should be strengthened falls in line with CCP directives, but there's a bit more to it. At the same time, a market-driven economy is the last thing the Chinese Communist Party would want. This goes against the interests and the nature of the CCP. The party relies on planned economies, subsidized industries, and directives that tightly control things like foreign investment. Li Keqiang has been challenging this, however. On September 11th, he stated during a teleconference that, quote, economic reform and opening up is the inevitable trend. And state media likewise omitted large portions of his remarks, given they didn't fall in line with CCP messaging. Among the big issues he pointed out was that the tight regulatory system in China under the CCP is its biggest hindrance to growth when it comes to small and medium businesses. And this means a lot for Chinese jobs and for growth of the economy. And he also stated that regulations care more about power and not responsibility. That's an indirect blow to CCP leaders like Xi Jinping. And while Li Keqiang has been pushing for lighter regulations, the the CCP appeared to fire back at them with directives on September 15th. Now, as we discussed previously on this show, the General Office of the CCP Central Committee released a document outlining a new policy that the United Front Work Department in China should work on expanding party influence over private industry through what they're calling a mixed ownership model. Again, mixed ownership meaning private and public. The CCP owns part of these companies. This was released just 4 days after Li Keqiang gave his remarks. And none of this appears to be accidental. Now, Li Keqiang, a bit of background on this. Li Keqiang and Xi Jinping have been sending different messages lately. This is among other apparent conflicts. They're being interpreted as a battle for control in China between Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang. And again, there are different factions behind them. And while Li is the head of the main economic government body in China, the State Council, he is still under the CCP, which gives Xi the ultimate authority over him and over the businesses in China. Now, as an example of this conflict, Li Keqiang made international headlines back in June when he pointed out China has around 600 million people who live on a monthly income of about 1,000 renminbi, or about $146. Now, in China, that's not enough to even rent a room in a medium-sized city. And the number of people living on that wage constitutes about 40% of the country's population, meaning that a lot of China is living in severe poverty. Now, when Li Keqiang revealed this, it was seen as a challenge to Xi's economic policies. It was seen as a direct blow to the effectiveness of what Xi Jinping has been trying to do with the Chinese economy. It was also seen as something damaging to the polished, modernizing image of China that the Communist Party has tried showing to the world. Now, we should be clear, though, when it comes to party alignment, factional alliances, and likely overall agendas. Li Keqiang would very likely play the same games as other Communist Party leaders were he to gain more power over the CCP. But this model that he's pushing would likely follow that laid down by former party leader Deng Xiaoping, who pushed for economic reforms in China and on painting a friendly image of the CCP to the world, while concealing its true motives. Now, there's a bit of background on this because it relates to what we're seeing right now. Deng Xiaoping's famous statement was, "Hide your strength, bide your time." Xi Jinping abandoned this doctrine, however, when it appeared the CCP's time had arrived on the world stage. But he's been criticized lately within the party for pushing too hard, too fast. People are saying he abandoned Deng Xiaoping's policies too rapidly. And they're blaming this on the fact that now the CCP is facing economic sanctions from the US, international pressure on human rights abuses of the CCP, and for causing different countries to pull their supply chains out of China. They're saying Xi Jinping showed his hand too readily to the rest of the world. And now, with this in mind, the trend of criticism against Xi within the Chinese Communist Party is his abandonment of the peaceful rise doctrine laid out by Deng Xiaoping. And if a party cadre were looking to usurp Xi Jinping's power, that cadre would likely use this as the main path of criticism. Li Keqiang's push for policies that are more closely aligned with Deng Xiaoping, along with his other statements to indirectly criticize and challenge Xi, appear to fall in line with this strategy. And meanwhile, the issue of the state-run economy in China has also been called out for being one of the country's biggest weak points. In particular, its use of massive state subsidies had led to problems of corruption, and state subsidies, as interventionist policies often do, have kept alive businesses that would otherwise fail. Now, the problem with this, going into economics, is something economists have pointed out from the moment interventionist policies emerged on the world stage, that state subsidies risk breaking the foundations of a market-driven economy. The CCP views a market-driven economy as something counter to its own interests and its own model. But again, these different methods it's using break the feedback loop between the consumer and businesses that you find in a market-driven economy. Now, in a normal economy, products follow public demand. Prices adjust based on what's sustainable both for production and for what people are willing to pay. And issues such as low quality and internal corruption within a company can quickly cause a business to fail. But when you have interventionist policies pushed by socialist regimes like the CCP, businesses that should fail are instead kept alive through subsidies. And their ability to operate without needing to draw a profit means they can strangle out competition and create monopolies. And this in turn can also prevent any possibility of competition from independent businesses, which in turn make it more difficult for people to start and operate small and medium businesses. And even more so, when corruption comes into the picture, the people committing the crimes are also the people making the laws, and people pulling the levers of government policy as well when it comes to the CCP. And so as corruption grows within these companies, the temptation to use power of law and government to feed personal interest likewise grows. Now through this, the problems of embezzlement and special interest in China have further corrupted the government and have also whittled away some of their economic interests from the inside. A lot of these companies are rotting from the inside. Its impact on business has led the CCP to turn towards tactics like intellectual property theft to keep its businesses competitive. Now, an analysis piece at Knowledge at Wharton points out similar issues in the Chinese economy. It notes that, quote, thanks in large part to domestic stimulus measures post-global financial crisis, the new debt of the country grew from around 150% of GDP in 2008 to around 225% of its GDP in 2016. In other words, the debt is expanding in China. Now, the stimulus helped the Chinese economy keep the image of growth. It also helped economies around the world to recover to an extent. But the CCP has used similar measures to keep things moving by giving the occasional stimulus. And this is not without its impact. It notes the problem with this method is more than just the debt when it relates to the GDP. Instead, the bigger issue is corporate debt. It notes that, quote, today more and more credit is going to pay off old credit for unproductive projects rather than to fuel new and productive investments. It quotes Marshall Meyer, Wharton Management Professor Emeritus, stating, quote, the problem is the more you invest, the lower the return on investment. In other words, China has these zombie economies, these zombie businesses that are feeding off these small and medium companies, and again, drawing the country further and further into debt. Although it's still creating the global image of an expanding economy, it's being sustained by unsustainable means, these direct investments and mega projects. And the CCP's solution to these problems is to double down on the causes of these problems. Its current push is for internal party purges to establish the unquestionable authority of the CCP, to at the same time increase party ownership over private industry, and to also increase its investments in construction mega projects like unneeded airports and ghost cities. And this plays directly into what Knowledge at Wharton notes has led to the corporate debt bubble. Now, as an example of this, the CCP pushed ahead with plans to help its state-owned companies grow by pushing tech firms like Tencent and Alibaba to invest in state-owned businesses that have been underperforming. In other words, to use independent businesses to subsidize failing state-run businesses. Again, subsidizing failure. The South China Morning Post reported that the investments by Alibaba and Tencent in these state-owned enterprises are seen as, quote, a testing ground for China's so-called mixed ownership reform to improve the services and earnings of state firms, something that they're currently expanding right now. And this is again to take advantage of the private sector to fuel the public sector, or seen in another light, to divert money from relatively private companies to those owned by the Chinese Communist Party and the CCP leadership. Now, in other news, when it comes to human rights in China, 63 MPs from around the world are calling for financial sanctions similar to the Magnitsky Act in response to the CCP's cultural genocide in Tibet. This could lead to governments freezing the assets of Chinese Communist Party officials involved in this persecution. And this is important for this reason. This is the international community expanding the focus of, say, sanctions on CCP officials involved in human rights abuses in China. Already they've done measures like this when it comes to the persecution of Uyghurs. They've used measures like this when it comes to the persecution in Hong Kong, again to officials involved in the ending of Hong Kong's autonomy. They're now expanding this potentially to the CCP's persecution of Tibet. And in related news to this with Christians and Catholics, the CCP has been altering the religion even further. Among the alterations now is one that claims Jesus killed a woman who had been taken in for adultery. Now, rather than telling people looking to stone the woman to death, saying that, quote, "Let he who is without sin throw the first stone," Bitter Winter reports that in the CCP's altered version of the religion, it now says that Jesus instead stones the woman to death, saying instead that I too am a sinner, but if the law could only be executed by men without blemish, the law would be dead. Now, this could be seen as an example of the Chinese Communist Party altering religion to support the idea of submission to the state, rather than having a higher moral reasoning. And also with the CCP's persecution of Muslim Uyghurs, researchers with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute have identified and mapped more than 380 suspected re-education camps, detention centers, and prisons in Xinjiang, which appear to have been newly built or expanded since 2017. Again, suggesting, taken in context of the other persecutions of religions, that the Chinese Communist Party is pushing forward its greater plans to persecute religions in China. Now, with that said, folks, we're again broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And also, if you want to support us, please consider joining us on Patreon. You can find the link to our Patreon page in the description below. Also, join us on Sunday for our live Q&A. Also, folks, as I mentioned, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel. And if you want to go the extra mile, you can tell a friend or family member about Crossroads. And also, please consider sharing this video. Now, that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.